found me one. Oh, that's all. That's a good idea.
You'd think you'd eventually learn his daughter-in-law's name.
You ain't learning yet.
I don't never call her by her name.
What's going to happen when he gets another one?
I don't know, number 2, probably.
Yeah, be number 2.
Look at Shonda's head.
Shonda got an Easter hat on.
She does. Shonda has her Easter hat on.
Everybody did you dress up for Easter?
I think I got one too. I should go in there in the closet and hunt it.
Everybody needs a good daughter-in-law.
I said, what's going to happen when you get 2? What are you going to call the second one?
Number 2. That's what Daddy always calls me. Number 2.
Number 2.
Just my opinion, but that might cause her feelings saying there's a number 1.
Huh?
I hadn't thought about that. Diane, do you see my wall?
Yes, I did.
That's
It looks good.
an improvement.
That's an improvement.
Mike Wilson used to call me his number 1 too, but I told him I was number 2.
Sandy's the trick, isn't she? Fixing her wall.
Yeah, very much so. I showed a couple of the men. I don't think I showed any of the women. I showed a couple of men what was hanging there before.
I heard.
You heard?
I heard.
I showed it to Sandy yesterday. She said I made a good decision. I said the Lord showed that to me before I went live for the first time.
Don't hurt about that.
But I've got all kinds of posters from video games, Legend of Zelda and Pokemon and all that stuff. So that's my
About time
Bible.
to grow up, Jimmy. Might be about time to grow up. You're getting old for posters.
He's been moved out for a long time. You'd think I'd get around to fixing it.
You're on.
All right. My wife tells me that we're ready to go, so if you've not already heard the news, our study is starting in Lamentations this week, and what this is going to look like, I don't have a clue. I just know that we landed in the book of Lamentations. God's will that we be here, and I'm sure He has a plan for us being here in this book of Lamentations this week, and my wife tells me that everybody's ready and that we're on Facebook Live, I think now. But
Make sure the volume's turned up.
Yeah, Daddy.
If you're watching live, can everybody hear him? Or somebody give me a thumbs up or something so I know it's working.
I hear you. Good morning, everybody.
all right. So Lamentations and the study that I did a little bit in the last few days on this, and before I had never had a question in my life of any other person than Jeremiah had wrote this book, and why that some of the commentaries that I looked at thought maybe Jeremiah didn't write it. I don't know where they arrived at that idea, but it really has Jeremiah's fingerprints all over it when you read through it and you read back at some of Jeremiah's writings in the book of Jeremiah. But if you stop a minute and the title of it is called Lamentations. And if you get out your Googler and you look up the definition of lamentation. And lamentation says, the passionate expression of grief or sorrow or weeping. And Jeremiah was heartbroken because here he was in this city that he had called home. No doubt Jerusalem is the city that he's talking about, and he's looking around at utter destruction, and no doubt he is, as the saying goes, he has hurt feelings because of it. And as we read over the next several weeks, he kind of talks about the destruction he's seen at different times, and he's grieving over all that's going on there. All right, we'll start out with a word of prayer this morning. Blessed Father, thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to study your word and to be found faithful. Lord, assembling ourselves together this morning, Lord, in a different way than what we're used to, but Lord, you've revealed unto us that we can do it, Lord, no matter what, that in troubling times that you're still in control. And Lord, I do pray now that, Lord, you give us what we should have from your word this morning, that we might take it and stick it to our hearts, Lord, and use it to point a lost soul to your saving grace. Forgive us now where we fail you. In Jesus' name I pray, and amen. All right. Lamentations, chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, how doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? And how is she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces? How is she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her, and they are become her enemies. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction, and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen, she find no rest, and all her persecutors overtook her between the straits. The way of Zion do mourn, because none comes to the solemn feast. All her gates are desolate, her priests sigh, and her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Her adversaries are the chief, her enemies prosper, for the Lord hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. And from the daughter of Zion all her beauty is departed. Her princes are become like harts that find no pasture, and they are gone without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembered in the days of her affliction, above her miseries, all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, and none did help her. The adversaries saw her and did mock at her Sabbaths. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned, therefore she is removed. All that honoureth her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she sigheth and turneth backwards. Her filthiness is in her skirts, and she remembered not her last end. Therefore she came down wonderfully. She had no comforter, O Lord. Behold my affliction, for the enemy hath magnified himself. The adversary hath spread out his hands upon all her pleasant things. For she hath seen that the heathen entered into her sanctuary, whom thou did command that they should not enter into thy congregation. And all her people sigh, they seek bread, and they have given their pleasant things for meat to relieve the soul. See, O Lord, and consider, for I am become vile. All right, we'll stop right there at verse 11 and talk a little bit. And as always in the past, if you have a question, jump right in there And I'm not by no means an authority on anything that related to the Bible. But if you feel I'm wrong, now's the time to speak up. But here we find Jeremiah right in the heart of the city. And the city, he says, sits solitary, that was full of people. You know, I have a bad habit of looking at webcams. Webcams, if you look a little bit, you'll find one in about any place you want to be. And right now, this day and time, you can find one of Times Square in New York. And at times in the past, about any time you look there were people there just elbow to elbow. Traffic going by and just non-stop bustle. People moving about, doing their thing, going where they want to go. But I looked at it a couple days ago, and there might have been 4 or 5 people the whole time I watched it, which was a span of probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes maybe at the most. But I just peeked at it, and a few people went by on bicycles and 1 or 2 walking by. But we can kind of relate to that as to what Jeremiah was seeing in his beloved city. And now, among our nation, you know, things that we once seen, you know, moving, coming, going, economy booming, and things on top of everything. And now it's solitaire, that Jeremiah says. And how is she become tributary? It says she owes somebody something. You know, she is a slave now. She has been led away, the nation of Israel has, from Jerusalem, because Nebuchadnezzar has came in and has carried them away captive. He's broken down the walls. If you go back in the book of Jeremiah and kind of read how it took place, it didn't all happen at once. It happened over a time, but nonetheless, Nebuchadnezzar came in and overthrew the nation right there. And for what reason Jeremiah was left behind, other than because God wanted him there left behind, I couldn't answer that. But here we find Jeremiah left behind in that city, weeping for that city. And it says in verse 2 that all her friends have dealt treacherously and are become her enemies. Up to this point, Egypt had told the nations of Israel, we've got your back, you know, we'll back you up in your time of need. And now they have forsaken them. They've become her enemy. And the Chaldeans, you know, Nebuchadnezzar, in our last study, the Ninevites were no doubt in on this. You know, the book of Jonah was less than 100 years before this occurred. And now we find that those people most likely that repented are part of the crowd that has came in and overthrew the city of Jerusalem here. And going right on with this, the streets are empty. People are hungry. She dwelleth among the heathen, it says in verse 3, and findeth no rest. And her persecutors overtook her. And if you go back and look at that, they overtook her between the straits. That kind of goes back to how the king, when they were besieged in the city, and we'll look at that in just a second, they were in the city besieged for a year. And the king and some of his army, some of his, we'll call it the inner circle, snuck out of the city. But Nebuchadnezzar's armies overtook him, and they caught him, and put the king into slavery, and put his sons to death. And if you want to turn back and look at that, we go back to Jeremiah, just a few pages back. Jeremiah chapter 52. And we'll start there in verse 1. And it tells who the king was at the time when this took place. It says Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign. And that's a whole nother opinion of mine about how old the king was there. And Nina knows my opinion about that age. But here he was, 21-year-old king. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. That was his father, Jehoiakim. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, till he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So they were already being bullied by Nebuchadnezzar, you know. Nebuchadnezzar had done told them, you know, kind of like a bully when you're a child in school, taking your lunch money. Give me your lunch money every day, and I won't beat you up. Kind of what Nebuchadnezzar was doing for him at the time. But it says he rebelled. He said, we're not going to pay you anymore. We're not going to give you tribute like we've been doing. And then verse 4 says, and it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, and in the 10th month of the 10th day, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and built forts against it round about. So the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And in the 4th month, in the 9th day of the month, the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. And then the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled, and went forth out of the city by night, by the way of the gate between the two walls, which was the king's garden. And now the Chaldeans were by the city round about, and they went by the way of the plain. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued after the king, and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. So, our 21-year-old king has fled the scene now. He is left with his army during this siege. And if you're like me, I like to watch these movies, these gladiator movies of old times about these men, and they've got these leather war suits on, whatever you want to call them. They'll have suits of armor. And a lot of that is what these guys look like that besieged Jerusalem. And if you look at real close at what it says there about when they started besieging them. Alright, now let's back up here. Besieged, if you look at the definition of besieged, besieged is to surround with armed forces, to cause worry or distress. So here these folks are behind the walls in Jerusalem. And outside is Nebuchadnezzar and his armies out there. No one can get out of Jerusalem. And this been on for, maybe I'm wrong, but the way I counted it up, it was a year and a half. Now, with what we're familiar with, I live up on a little hill here, and if some army surrounded me, I'm not sure I could make it a year and a half without coming off this hill. And that's kind of how Jerusalem was. They were behind these walls, and outside, no doubt, was these armies of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's men out there. And maybe there were some of them that were kind of like Goliath was. And they were standing outside the walls, shouting out to Jerusalem, "Where's your God at now that's going to protect you? Why don't he release you from this? Why don't you cry out to him?" But this went on for a year and a half. Outside these walls, no doubt people died. No doubt there was sickness behind the walls. And no doubt People in desperate times done desperate things. And Jeremiah has been right there and seen it all. He's seen all this come to pass. And just picture that. Held captive in your own home for a year and a half was where these people were at. And then after that, Judah has gone into captivity because of affliction, verse 3 says. So after all this time, Nebuchadnezzar finally gives the order. Men, they're weak enough now. It's time for you to go in and take them. I don't know how it worked, how that the king had already sneaked out through a hole in the wall somewhere, him and his army. Or that happened during the attack, after the attack. I don't have that answer. Only God knows that for sure. But nonetheless, here we find these people led off into captivity. And verse 4 talks about even the streets are mourning. It says, the ways of Zion do mourn, because none come to the solemn feast. You know, we've talked in the past about the feast that they kept, and all of the feasts of unleavened bread, and on and on and on and on. But over a year it went by, and now the streets were empty, and many starved to death. No doubt there were dead bodies around at this time that Jeremiah had seen, and there were people in dire straits that were left behind. Because if you study this closer, that Nebuchadnezzar left behind the poorest of the poor. He left some of them behind, and here they are in dire straits, suffering in this time that many have been carried away. And the things that happened at the temple, maybe when Jeremiah's writing this, the temple's not been destroyed yet. Maybe the temple's still standing, because some time went by before Nebuchadnezzar carried all this out. It didn't all happen in one day. But maybe Jeremiah's standing there looking at the temple when he thinks of this. But he says, none come to the solemn feast. They all went to the temple at times. And Jeremiah is lamenting. That's a big word for me, you know, lamenting. You know, here's Jeremiah having a hard time over this. And none have come to the solemn feast. And then verse 5, her adversaries are chief, Jeremiah says. And then Jeremiah gives the reason why that they're in this trouble that they're suffering through. The Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. The multitude of her transgressions. And the reason that they are in the place that they're in is because of their sinful lifestyles that they've chose. Because of, we've turned away from God, Israel has. And we talked about the leader a minute ago, how he had walked in the ways of his father, walking not in the ways of the Lord, and he's turned away. And there's why they're in captivity. Don't let me have all the fun. Anybody got a comment? Join right in there.
Hey, Keith.
Yes, sir.
The neat thing, one of the neat things about this is that the book before the book of Jeremiah is Jeremiah's warning.
Yeah.
And it being carried out. But if you'll remember, starting in chapter 1, warning people, this is what's coming. God's judgment's coming, and they just kind of scoffed at it. Then you get to Lamentations, where Jeremiah's weeping over this judgment that's come, and you know, and he understands why that it's come, and you know, the human side of Jeremiah, he could have looked at them and said, I told you so.
That's right.
He could have gloated, said, you got what you deserved, and I warned you and I told you, now you're going to have to deal with it. but he doesn't deal with it like that. He deals with it totally opposite. He is distraught and heartbroken over the shape of his nation. He doesn't take any glee in it whatsoever.
None. Yeah. For lack of a better word, Jeremiah could say, these are my people, them's my people that's been carried out. And like you said, he's all the way through this book of Lamentations, 5 chapters, and 95% of it is Jeremiah just heartbroken. Parts of it, he is pointing to the saving grace that God will allow us if we'll only ask for it. But a great majority of it is, Jeremiah's state of mind, state of his heart, that his heart is broken for what's happened. All right. Anybody else? And we'll move right on. All right. Then going to verse 7. Jerusalem. I've kind of underlined a few little key words in this. Jerusalem remembered all her pleasant things. We're remembering right now some of the pleasant things that we used to have. We've talked about in the last few days how, we all like to go see a good ball game. We all like to get out and congregate together and fellowship with each other, be it at a ball game or a meeting of whatever sort, and God has took that away from us for a time, for lack of a better word, and maybe now we are remembering the pleasant things that we had in the past. Are they maybe things that we put before God? Maybe they are. But none did help her, it says. Jeremiah said, none did help her. And then it talks about the adversaries saw her and did mock at her Sabbaths, They made fun of them over days that they had set aside, to call upon God, days to remember what God has done for us, the Sabbaths it calls them. And then Jeremiah says it again in verse 8. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned. Bottom line, all of us are sinful folks. All of us have a shortcoming in one way or another. We all fall short of the glory of God. And then Jeremiah's pointing it out in the laws of physics. Every action has a reaction. And there it says, Jerusalem has grievously sinned. The reaction, she is removed from her land. And then Jeremiah goes on to point out how they have seen her nakedness. And that's kind of pointing back to how that a prostitute in that day, when they would have been punished for what they were doing, they would have been stripped of their garments and left standing naked right there in front of the whole world. And Jeremiah's kind of paralleling what they've done to, following after other gods instead of the one true God. Being unfaithful. We've read about unfaithfulness in the Bible in times past, and that's kind of what Jeremiah's pointing out here. Because of their unfaithfulness, they have been stripped of their garments, there for the whole world to see of the wrongdoing they've done. And then verse 10, here Jeremiah's talking about the temple. The temple, to every Jewish person that would have lived there at that time, would have been a sacred place. Just like our little buildings beside the road now that we call church houses was kind of a sacred place to us. And Jeremiah's pointing out that the heathen have entered into the sanctuary. And we've talked about how the temples was laid out, about the Holy of Holies and the places where only the priests could enter in, and that only certain folks that had went through certain rituals and cleansed themselves according to the Levitical law in one way or another could enter into a certain place. And it says here that the heathen, anybody, all these Chaldean armies, Jeremiah's fighting men had entered in there and had plundered the temple. They took the gold things off the wall, all the tools that they used for the sacrifices, and carried them off. And it says they should not enter into thy congregation. They shouldn't be in here, but nonetheless, they've came in. And then verse 11 points out the desperate folks that are there and have been there. They seek bread. My friends, when you get hungry, when you get to a place where you have nothing to eat, $100 bill won't mean a thing to you beside a piece of cornbread. If you have a choice between the two, when you get hungry, you'll take the cornbread over the $100 bill any day. And that was the place that they were at. They've given their pleasant things for meat. You know, these folks might have lived pretty high there at this time. They might have had the best of the best. And they've traded what they had for a little piece of meat, whatever they could get to eat. And that was the place they had arrived at. And Jeremiah's pointing that out here, where they're at this time. All right, anybody got anything else? We'll read on a little farther here. All right. Verse 12 then. Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by, behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow, which is done unto me, wherewith the Lord hath afflicted me in the day of his fierce anger. From above hath he sent far into my bones, and it prevailed against them. He hath spread a net for my feet. He hath turned me back, and has made me desolate and faint all the day. The yoke of my transgressions is bound by his hands. They are wreathed and come up upon my neck. He hath made my strength to fall. The Lord hath delivered me into their hands, from whom I am not able to rise up. The Lord hath trodden underfoot all my mighty men in the midst of me. He hath called an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord hath trodden the virgin, the daughter of Judah, as in a winepress. For these things I weep, mine eye runneth down with water, because the Comforter that should relieve my soul is far from me. My children are desolate, because the enemy prevailed. Zion spread forth her hands, and there is none to comfort her. The Lord hath commanded concerning Jacob, that his adversaries should be round about him. Jerusalem is as a menstruous woman among them. The Lord is righteous, for I have rebelled against his commandment. Hear, I pray you, all people, and behold my sorrow. My virgins and my young men are gone into captivity. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and mine elders gave up the ghost in the city, while they sought their meat to relieve their souls. Behold, O Lord, for I am in distress. My bowels are troubled. My heart is turned within me. For I have grievously rebelled. Abroad the sword bereaveth, and at home there is as death. They have heard that I sigh. There is none to comfort me. All mine enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that thou hast done it, and thou wilt bring the day that thou hast called, and they shall be like unto me. Let all their wickedness come before thee, and do unto them as thou hast done unto me. For all my transgressions, for all my sighs are many, as my heart is faint. So Jeremiah goes right on through the rest of the chapter, and I can just picture him writing this down with tears rolling down his cheek, his heart broke for his people, for his city that he has no doubt grew up in. He's probably been there all his life. And now he finds it desolate and forsaken and carried off by, no doubt, men that had seen him from across the wall, starved to death nearly, and no doubt they had sickness about them and had withered away to nothing, because these men there that held them captive from afar, and he's asking, is it nothing to you, all you that pass by? Is there any sorrow like mine, Jeremiah says. And in verse 13, Jeremiah is pointing out here that God is passing judgment upon them for their turning away from God. For he is talking about far sent into my bone, far from above. And when you see that, most likely it represents judgment, and far from above. And if you turn on over into the book of Revelations in a few places, you find words that correspond to this, back to this event and to things that will happen in the future. And he's talking about spreading a net for my feet, taking them captive. The way that these soldiers might have took some of these captives in this way is they had nets with weights on each end of them, and they would throw them. Somebody running and would wrap around their feet. And if you've ever tried to run in a sack race with your feet tied together, you know it don't work too well. But they would find themselves tied up down on the ground begging for mercy from these soldiers. And Jeremiah had no doubt seen this. And then he goes on in verse 15, talking about the Lord trodden underfoot all these mighty men. No doubt he's talking about the soldiers who left with the king and they were overtook by Nebuchadnezzar's army. He's no doubt talking about them. And then he's talking about the Lord hath trodden the daughter of Judah as in a wine press. Another thing that you can find in Revelation that it talks about in the last days, about judgment from God and blood being pressed like from a wine press, and a whole nother category to talk about today, but it's kind of a contrast to this. Trodden the virgin, and when you crush grapes, that out comes the grape juice, or blood, as we're talking about in the other book. But here it is. Verse 16 says again, for these things I weep. Jeremiah is weeping once again, as heartbroken. And going right on, Jeremiah points out in verse 18, he calls out the truth. The Lord is righteous, it says. Verse 18 says, let's hear that one more time. The Lord is righteous. If you feel like you're somebody good today and you've got sin under control and sin can't touch you, compare yourself to God the Father. Compare yourself to His Son, Jesus Christ. How do you measure up against His righteousness? You don't stand much of a chance. But there it is. He points it out. The Lord is righteousness. And he says, I have rebelled at His commandment. And he's talking about himself personally, no doubt. And he's talking about Jerusalem as a whole. And then going right on, verse 19 says, I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. And I have no doubt that Jeremiah is talking about those that had said they would help them in their times of troubles. Those that had like we have at our nation, we have allies, and Jerusalem had allies as well in that day, and if they had not come to the rescue for a year and a half, all these other people had a chance to come and help them while that Nebuchadnezzar had their city surrounded. Nebuchadnezzar was there, no doubt, outside the gate. At this time, it would have been the way they did things with the king would have went to battle with them. He would have been right there in the midst. And there they would have been, day in, day out, taunting and calling out to those behind the wall, "We've got you. We've got you right where we want you." Here at this time, there they were in captivity in their own home. But nobody came to help them. All right, anybody got anything to add? Don't let me get too far ahead if you've got anything to say.
Hey, Keith.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sandy.
Is this a good place to insert an English lesson?
You're the English teacher, of course it is.
Okay. I can't hardly hear all of a sudden.
You're kind of coming in and out.
I don't know why. That may be the Lord's way of telling me it's not a good place for an English lesson. I don't know.
Or just go with it.
Okay. All right.
But I need to tell you all about this at some point. It's about the poetry aspect of this book. Somehow I'll tell you about it.
Right. It is written from a really poetic, I don't know, I'm no English teacher, and thanks to Debbie Estridge, I managed to get out of high school, but beyond that, yeah. But beyond that,
It's really neat.
yeah. I'd like to hear you and Debbie talk about that. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, we'll do it.
Go ahead, Jimmy. You was gonna say something.
I was just going to say, and I've just read the headlines, but in verse 19, whenever he talks about I called for my lovers, and that's a you're talking about like the adversaries and stuff.
Yeah.
And that puts me in mind on this COVID-19 in China, and what I've read in some headlines, and I'm not really dived into it real deep, but Italy, I think it was, Italy sent China all these, like, stuff to help with that, to fight that. And I can't remember if it was the ventilators or what it was. And then Italy falls victim to it, and China sells that stuff back to them. Don't give it to them. Italy give it to China.
Yeah.
But China sells it back to them. Kind of takes advantage of them like that.
Right.
And that's kind of what that put me in mind. The adversaries, you call them, or allies.
Allies,
the
allies.
The ones that they had depended on and was their friends, and the ones that allegedly would stand with them. They're not standing with them. They all forsook them. Egypt and other places. All forsook them. Was like, no, you're on your own on this.
Yeah. Maybe that's a lot of what that looked like, because Jerusalem had been paying tribute to them, They had been giving them money up to this point. And then here they find themselves in a hard place, and, But we'll look into the last little bit of this, and, Jeremiah's heart is no doubt broken beyond belief. And in the very last 2 verses of this chapter, Jeremiah is calling on God to, a word we've heard in the past, for him to zap Nebuchadnezzar. And the last couple verses there, Jeremiah says, "Let all their wickedness come before thee, and do unto them as thou hast done unto me, for all my transgressions. For my sighs are many and my heart is faint." So Jeremiah's kind of wanting God to just overthrow Nebuchadnezzar. And eventually we do see that happen. You know, we do see Babylon fall. And we all know what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. How that he loses his mind and he wanders out there and the dew of the night falls on him and his fingernails grows out and his toenails grows out and he's a wild man all of a sudden. We all know what happens to Nebuchadnezzar on down the road. Is that why that happened? Because of what Jeremiah asked for here? I wouldn't argue that one way or another. But fast forward on a few thousand years but don't let me get ahead of this. We know what Jeremiah has witnessed here. He's seen his people, you know. We all associate somebody as our people. And Jeremiah has seen his people treated bad, led away, no doubt, naked, and led away with hooks in their jaws, most likely. As Calvin always tried to point out to us, most likely how they were led away. And here they are, led away. And when somebody is doing you people wrong, your feelings are hurt to the core. And Jeremiah is calling on God to zap them, you know, to take them away, rub them out. But we fast forward a couple thousand years later, on over in the book of Matthew, chapter 5. I mark my Bible, but sometimes it don't do me much good to mark my Bible. I still can't find it. But anyhow, fast forward a few thousand years to Matthew chapter 5 and verses 44. And a man named Jesus, you know, this is how he told us to deal with our enemies. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh the sun to rise on the evil. You hear that? The sun rises on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. So, all that was going on here at this time, Jesus said it right there. God's still in control. God gives the evil men the breath of life just like he gives it to the just, to the innocent. And that's what salvation is all about right there. Jesus called upon us to love each other, you know, to help each other out. And when we're in the spot that Jeremiah's in, would it be easy for us to pray for those that have used us, those that have put us down, have led us away naked with hooks in our jaws? Or would we pray for them and ask God to have mercy on them? And how would that look? I don't have the answer for that. And so we'll leave it right there for this week. And anybody's got any comments, bring them right on. We'd like to hear them. And any more discussion. We get any Facebook questions?
None so far.
No Facebook questions? All right. As the auctioneer says, going, souls. That's the end of our discussion for today. And I guess we'll move on now to singing or whatever it is we do at church on Sunday.
Special singing this week is Dustin and Gina Estridge, and I have already posted them on the Green Hill page. They're going to be a better quality if you just go watch them on there, and it is absolutely beautiful. So please enjoy their Easter message within their songs. That's it. Jim will be coming with the preaching in just a few minutes, and he's going to switch over to his live. So I'm going to stop this one and let him take over in just a few minutes.
Nina,